we realized something that is basically happening with Mexico here in America. And my question is, because of Yugoslavia and all of the other countries that are infiltrating into Germany, don't you think there's a lot more land here in America, and why the greed?
You lost me about greed.
Well, I think what I'm trying to say is, if we're a land that in God we trust, and Jesus says, let the children come to me, wouldn't you agree that we need to open our arms to Mexico?
No. It's not at all clear that if you were to throw the borders wide open, let anyone come who wants to, that this would still be the same country 50 years from now. And so, in a sense, you can't let everybody come to America, because if everybody came to America, it wouldn't be America anymore.
We'd have a job opening, and we'd get 50 calls from Washington, D.C., from black people, who wanted the jobs, and the management of the restaurant would end up hiring an illegal Mexican to do the work. And I thought this was terrible, whereas before the blacks were always getting those jobs.
This book is really quite an achievement in tracing the history of migrations throughout the world. What would you say is the most important lesson it teaches us as we debate the issue today?
Well, first of all, it says that there's no such thing as immigrants in general, that there are immigrants from different places with radically different skills, that every group has a very pronounced pattern, has a pronounced pattern of skills.
What explains the remarkable persistence of some groups? No matter where they travel around the world, they seem to not only carry those cultural traits with them, but in some cases they're highly successful regardless of where they are.
Well, that's the great question. I'm still struggling to get people to admit that there are these patterns, because the prevailing doctrine in social science is that the group is really the creature of the surrounding society, of the institutions and the biases and so forth. And so one of the keynotes of the whole book and of my studies in general is that these groups have their own internal patterns. And you can see that very dramatically in many groups. I think the groups that have a full range of skills, they have businessmen, they have workers, they have the whole range, they can have their own little enclaves. And in fact, the Germans and the Jews at one time had that kind of system. You could live on the Lower East Side of New York and you have your own doctors, your own businessmen, your own stores, everything, speaking Yiddish every day without a word of English, and go on and live a lifetime that way.
Is that good? I mean,
it has its pluses and minuses. But if you have a group that is mostly unskilled workers, then they have to work for somebody else, and they have to be able to understand somebody else's language, and so it's crucial for them to acquire the
most
culture.
Americans, I know most of the viewers out there, you would want immigrants to speak English.
Most of the immigrants themselves want to speak English. The reason there's a controversy is that you have many activists, both from within the group and people in the larger society, who want to keep them foreign. But most of the immigrants themselves want to become Americans.
Self-appointed do-gooders.
Oh, you got it.
I want to talk more about that. But let's talk to Dirk in Navasota, Texas. Thanks for calling Borderline.
Hello, yes, I have a question for Mr. Sowell.
Shoot.
Mr. Sowell, I live in Germany, and I went there 10 years ago, and I'm an American. And when the borders fell in Berlin, and we let East Germany be a part of West Germany, now we're all one, we realized something that is basically happening with Mexico here in America. And my question is, because of Yugoslavia and all of the other countries that are infiltrating into Germany, don't you think there's a lot more land here in America, and why the greed?
You lost me about greed.
Well, I think what I'm trying to say is, if we're a land that in God we trust, and Jesus says, let the children come to me, wouldn't you agree that we need to open our arms to Mexico?
No, because every country has to protect its own borders. There was a time when virtually every country in the Western Hemisphere not only allowed but encouraged immigration on a massive scale, because they had the land and they needed the resources and so on. It's not at all clear that if you were to throw the borders wide open and let anyone come who wants to, that this would still be the same country 50 years from now. And so, in a sense, you can't let everybody come to America, because if everybody came to America, it wouldn't be America anymore. So that's not an option that we have. Most we can do is try to weigh many very different kinds of considerations.
Well, judging from the success of various groups in your book, who should come to America? How should we decide?
Oh, that's a much tougher one. But I think that we should say that we do have the right to decide. And if people who come here from country X do well and make America a better place, then let more people come here from country X. And if people who come from country Y simply come here and become a burden on the American taxpayers, then less people should come from country Y. One of the problems we have is that the welfare state makes it very expensive to let immigrants in. So you have a country like New Zealand, whose total population is less than that of New York City. And they have all kinds of barriers against immigrants. They've got 60 million sheep there and 3 million people.
It's not about greed. It's simply about common sense. People who advocate for this unlimited amount of immigration they're not living in reality. They're the exact types of people who often don't deal with the consequences of unlimited immigration. Immigration can be good if it's controlled. But this idea that just unlimited amounts of people from wherever should just be allowed to show up wherever they want, it's just a recipe for disaster. The best case scenario is that you have an immigration system that selects for the best and most productive people and allows them to come in. That's the best case scenario.
Okay, let's talk to Paul in Springfield. Paul, thanks for calling.
Thank you, Dr. Sowell. I'm a big fan of yours, and urge you to keep up the good work. You're really, I think a lot of you. I guess I have one premise, and then I guess maybe two premises here. I think that it's important that for our sake of our national identity and for public policy reasons, I think that immigrants largely assimilate. They learn to speak the language, they learn the bourgeois work ethic, and these sorts of things. And I guess kind of as proof of that is that before we had this huge welfare safety net, immigrants who came here had to learn those sorts of things, and they seem to be absorbed into American society quicker simply because of necessity. They had to become one of us, so to say. And I would just like your comments on that.
Oh, absolutely, no question about it. While some groups did retain their languages and customs and so on, but even the Germans eventually began to speak English. And once the younger generation came along and learned English, why then the whole group over time very quickly became assimilated. But again, it is the welfare state. It's more than that. It's the so-called multiculturalism, which is really encouraging people to paint themselves into their own little corners and try to make it on their own.
To me, it's just like people should be eager to assimilate to whatever country you're trying to immigrate to. And that's not saying to completely forget your culture or where you come from. It's just saying understand that there are rules and standards that need to be upheld. It's the most ridiculous concept to me. The idea that you can show up to another person's country, sometimes illegally, and then make demands about how they should be giving you access to whatever resources that you didn't even contribute to. It's like walking into someone's house, opening their fridge, and then asking them, why don't they have juice?
Okay, let's talk to Diana in Great Falls, a first-time caller. Thanks for calling.
Yes, thank you. Mr. Sowell, one thing I wanted to ask you about, I actually have two questions. I have been really surprised that more black leaders have not spoken up because basically it seems to me that it's the black people who have lost the most through job opportunities with this unlimited immigration. I'll give you an example. I noticed this under the Carter administration back when I used to be a waitress in a restaurant. And we'd have a job opening and we'd get 50 calls from Washington, D.C., from black people, who wanted the jobs. And the management of the restaurant would end up hiring an illegal Mexican to do the work. And I thought this was terrible, whereas before the blacks were always getting those jobs in restaurants and things. This has been, now you've got Indians, Pakistanis, all these different people have taken these jobs over, and it's pushed the blacks more and more into this basically a ghetto existence, except for the few, the minority, who've been able to get out. And it's pushed them further into drugs and everything else. This should have been their chance, with the equal opportunity and everything, to get up the ladder and to really assimilate into the population. It really hasn't happened. My other question, I spent a lot of time in Central America, particularly in the Caribbean Basin, and all the blacks up there are immigrating into the United States. And what really shocked me is how quickly they rise up the economic ladder, very quickly own their own homes and become middle class.
All right, let's get a response.
Well, I guess the first one, in some particular cases, what you say may be true, but there have been studies done of places where there's a heavy Mexican immigration, for example, and the unemployment rate among blacks in those areas tends to be lower than it is elsewhere. There's not some fixed number of jobs from which the immigrants, you subtract the number that go to the immigrants. The immigrants themselves create jobs, both when they're employers and simply by the fact that they increase the national output, which increases the demand and therefore increases the demand for labor. So it's not at all clear to me that the immigrants take the jobs away. What may happen in many cases, however, and in many countries, is that the immigrants, because they come in, and particularly at the bottom level jobs, they prevent the wages from rising enough in those jobs to wean people away from the welfare state benefits. And so therefore we end up supporting more Native Americans because of the immigrants. We may not be supporting the immigrants directly, but they will prevent the wages from rising.
All of us have seen examples, though, of where we see an immigrant who doesn't speak very good English, and they've got a PhD, but they just got here, and they know eventually maybe they're going to make their way into, say, the engineering field. But in the meantime, they're going to wait tables.
Yes.
Because they know that it's only temporary, 2 or 3 years, they're willing to work all day for a bucket of fish heads, basically.
Yes.
They're willing to work for no pay. Now, I mean, clearly, you have Americans who are they're not destined to go to college, or they're not destined to go into the technical fields for whatever reason. Doesn't the influx of that labor pool that's willing to compete on those terms, erode the bargaining leverage of Americans who, in a sense, are looking to live a decent life
Well,
for 30 years?
if they plan to work all their lives at minimum wage jobs, which nobody does hardly, yes. But the very same things that allows the immigrant to start off, as many of the Cubans did, shining shoes and moving on up, will allow other people to start off shining shoes and move on up.
Freedom means inequality, by definition,
Yes.
right? Okay. All right, we got a lot of calls, and we'll get back to them.
Freedom means inequality. Very well said. That's unfortunate. That's the unfortunate reality. If you want freedom, you have to accept inequality. That was a very fascinating video, especially when you consider that these same discussions are raging on to this day.